Yeah, so it's been great to see it two different times and really pay attention to what you're explaining and the principles behind it. I think the two things that really stick out to me that make a huge difference are, number one, everything you present is research evidence-based. So it's all the information that we know between pain science, the latest on women's health, pelvic health, and you incorporate it into your course and all of your principles throughout. So it makes it really nice that you already took care of all the science and we don't have to worry that this isn't the latest information. So that's huge. Another thing I like is that you bust many of the myths that we think and know. So for example, a perfect example is we hear never do a plank, or we hear crunches are awful. If you have pelvic organ prolapse, if you have incontinence, you should never ever ever do a plank or a crunch. And we don't necessarily say why, we just say don't ever do it. And I think you explain in a very nice way that really there's not necessarily one bad movement. It's finding movements that work for people and explaining if you do a crunch or you do any kind of other exercise, why it's not necessarily the worst thing. And you explain that very, very well. Well, it's interesting. You talk a lot about scaling exercises and how you can change things to modify for people. And I think you actually do that quite well in terms of scaling for your audience. So I see that when you were more with a trainer type of group, you were able to scale that more for them and their needs. And then I see when it was more heavy-based pelvic physical therapists and women's health specialists, you also added extra things for that population as well and a different type of education. But in the end, it's all the really same great information. It's just you're able to scale it very nicely and meet them where they are. And the other thing I actually really love is that you took, there are pelvic health therapists out there who have never seen CrossFit, who have never been exposed to this kind of training before. And I think there are a lot of myths busted about that as well, in terms of it being scary or intimidating or maybe harmful to patients or clients, when they realize, no, actually, if you do it safely and you scale these exercises, they can work out really well for anyone and at any population, in terms of age, any kind of demographic, it works really well with no matter what they have. And the other thing for trainers is I don't think they understood a lot of the science behind pelvic organ prolapse, pain, pelvic pain, all sorts of things that we discussed in terms of the medical aspects. And you were able to bridge that gap as well and help them understand how when they're training or exercising themselves, what to look for and the right things to help answer questions that can be tough. If a client says, I have pelvic organ prolapse, what can I do? You provide some really great, solid information for them as well. I don't know what you mean by differently, but I will say that I like the fact that you break it into different things. So we had a whole section on squats, and you assess it from even the supine and then show how you can move that into different levels, to the point where they're doing squats, to the point where they're squatting and then jumping onto a box. So I really like how you sequence things in that way. And I also like how you start out with someone just doing a movement, and then you say, okay, now apply the principles you talk about in the class, and now how does that feel different for you? So you sequence in the way that you first start out with nothing, and then you start giving them cues to sequence them to be able to do that better. So I like there's a lot of that practical, and it's from everything from when we were doing warm-ups to jumping and running to actually doing squats and then even doing deadlifts and other exercises with weights. So we had many different practicals that you could do that were incorporating all different movements. I think the biggest thing is scaling, and I have some patients who are higher level. So for example, they are doing CrossFit already, or they're runners, and they say that they're leaking every time they jump, for example, a box jump. And I think it's really important to say, instead of saying don't ever do that, we tell that to people a lot. We'll say, you know what, if that's bothering you, it's the one thing that you're leaking, just stop doing it. And what the take home is that I've learned many different ways that I can scale that, from changing what they're doing, from doing things with them outside of jumping on the box, but then bringing them back to a box to jump and really understanding how to scale that. I think that's really important, probably one of the best practical things I know immediately would benefit many of my patients. Yeah, and I really honestly think everyone should take this class. I think that we start to see things on such a low level sometimes, we don't realize how we can really scale things. And many of us are afraid to go to that next level with patients and clients. So I highly, highly recommend this as a class that should be standard that everyone should be taking.